And then maybe one last question that actually also takes us back to China, but in particular comparing China to Japan. So we get that question a lot as well, and I've received it again today, both from a demographic standpoint, right, and also both large markets that have gone through kind of property overhangs. I mean, obviously comparing it to Japan, which is a market that hasn't grown in real terms for a number of decades, and the stock market itself only returning to highs relatively recently. The highs reached sort of pre-economic slowdown. So maybe you can chat us through your own thoughts around comparing China to Japan.
Sure. I think it is rational for investors to make that comparison, just given, you mentioned, right, aging population, you have property slowdown, but when we dive down into the weeds, we realize that that's pretty much where the similarity ends between the two economies. If we revisit Japan in the 1990s, they were already one of the richest countries in the world, right? Urbanization was close to 90%, per capita GDP was one of the highest in the world. They had a number of multinational businesses that were already leaders, not just in Japan, but on a global basis. Now, coming back to China, right? China today is seeing property slow down, but urbanization rate, as I mentioned in my presentation, still sits at 60+%, a long runway to grow there. They're still a developing country. And one of the biggest difference, I think, is the fact that when Japan's bubble burst, it was a result of strong economic growth driven by leading enterprises, the likes of Toyota, the likes of Toshiba and Sony, right? All these businesses spent the 1980s growing outside of Japan and driving the strong economic growth in Japan. And by the time the bubble burst in Japan, there was no one else to replace that growth. There wasn't anyone sitting in the back to take over some of the growth drivers from these leading enterprises. This is a big contrast to China because, as I mentioned earlier during the presentation, is that the property slowdown was self-inflicted. They make an active decision to say, I want to restructure the property sector. So on the bench, they have many sectors that are ready to take over the baton of growth for the economy. You have the automotive, electric vehicles, right? You have the likes of BYD, to our mind, is embarking on the first initial years of internalization, right? They are going to become the Toyota of the future. You have the solar industry. 80% of the entire solar supply chain sits in China, right? You have 60% of wind turbine being produced in China. All of these are new energy sectors that is going to help take over the baton of growth from some of these older industries. And all these are industries that are a lot more productive than the labor-intensive ones that are increasingly moving out of China into the Vietnams of the world, right? So, these are just some of the key differences. There are a lot more differences, but these are what give us comfort that China is simply not going to be the next Japan from a pessimistic standpoint.